Yeah, thanks everybody. Apologies here for a lot of folks that have seen this talk once, twice, three times. I don't know how many times you've seen this talk now. It seems like I've been given a lot the last couple of weeks, and I see some pretty familiar faces here. So I did change the title slide though. So at least like this slide, now there's a picture of me holding a salmon, so I can catch them when it's as good a fishing as what it has been the last couple of years. Um, we'll see if that continues, but last year I could catch them. I'll get right into this. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Salmon Working Group for Lake Michigan. This is part of the Lake Michigan Technical Committee. There's folks from all the different agencies around the lake that are working on gathering the data. And so what I'm presenting here is sort of a composite of data that's been collected from around the lakes, all the jurisdictions. So the predator prey ratio, I think probably most folks in here are familiar with this to some extent. It's very simply understood as it's the biomass of Chinook salmon to the biomass of alewives in Lake Michigan. And so you take that Chinook biomass, divide it by alewife biomass, and that gives you a predator prey ratio. So all that means is, if that number is increasing, that basically is telling you that there's relatively fewer prey available for the number of predators. So prey conditions are worsening for the predators that are out there. Low numbers are exactly the opposite. There's lots of prey available for the number of predators that are out there. So it's a pretty simple coefficient to look at what predator prey balance is in Lake Michigan. Now, in recent years, we've seen that Chinook salmon biomass has been trending upward. Correspondingly, alewife biomass has been trending downward, and that's resulted in a predator prey ratio that's increasing. So there's relatively fewer prey available because there's more predators and less of their preferred prey, which are alewives. So these numbers are updated through 2024. I just recently got the prey data from our USGS partners. So from their annual surveys, that'll allow me to update the prey model and update this ratio. So unfortunately, this isn't the latest and greatest. That hasn't been rolled out just yet. But I can present updates on several of the other indicators and talk about where I think the predator prey ratio is headed. So there's a number of these additional indicators that we look at in addition to the predator prey ratio that tell us something about conditions in Lake Michigan. The first of these indicators, I'll call them, indicator 1A and 1B here would also, maybe be like this. These are both representations of the size of Chinook salmon in Lake Michigan, which is pretty important. So the first is 1A, let's say, is the weight of an age 3 female Chinook returning to weirs and harbors. And so there's a number of these weirs and harbor surveys around Lake Michigan where we're getting information. So in Wisconsin, there's the Besadny Anadromous Fish Facility. They have their Root River Weir and their Strawberry Creek Weir. Michigan, we have places like the Boardman River Weir, the Little Manistee River Weir, and the Medusa Creek Weir in Charlevoix. And then Illinois does an electrofishing survey of their harbors. And so from those, we look at age 3 females that are coming back. In general, we see very similar patterns across these locations. Let's see if I can bring up a laser pointer here. We do see occasionally there's some departures where, maybe Strawberry Creek has some really large fish and harbors in Illinois have smaller fish. But in general, they track a very similar pattern. And collectively, what we've seen over the last couple of years, if we were to take all these data together, is that there's been a pretty steep downward trajectory over the last 6 years, suggesting that the size of these age 3 females that are returning to our weirs are much smaller than what they were back in 2019 when sizes peaked. Notably, the drop from 2024 to 2025 was over 2 pounds. So that's a pretty substantial drop and is now below 15 pounds, which is kind of a benchmark in Lake Michigan for relatively poor prey conditions. I will note here that earlier in the 2000s we saw these fluctuations up and down like this, and then we've had this period of increase and more recently decrease. These fluctuations are really interesting. This was a period when alewife biomass was extremely low. Chinook biomass was very high, but occasionally alewives would pull off these year classes. They would just, sort of pull one out of their hat, even though there wasn't a large spawning stock that was out there. And so in 2010, that was one of those years. There was a big year class of alewives that showed up, and the salmon really responded to that. So their size jumped up in 2011. Same thing happened in 2012, another year class of alewives. The Chinook salmon responded with much larger sizes. And then we had a couple poor years of recruitment with stocking cuts, poor wild recruitment in the fishery. There were just fewer Chinook salmon out there, and we saw this period of increased growth. Now, more recently, that trend has gone the other way. I just wanted to point out here that we can see these really rapid fluctuations from one year to another, corresponding to very closely to what's going on with the prey fish, with alewives. So this would be sort of indicator 1B. This is again another size-related metric for Chinook salmon. But now instead of at weirs, we're talking about the open lake waters of Lake Michigan. So this is basically from July 1st to August 15th. So sort of, the point where these salmon are going to be at their peak size and condition prior to spawning. And we're looking at the standard weight of a 35-inch Chinook salmon. So all that means is that if we were to pick any given year, let's pick on 2025 here, there's this really nice relationship between length and weight on any given year. But that relationship changes from year to year, just depending on how well the fish are growing, how much weight they're at a given size. And so if we take that relationship on any given year and we trace a line up from 35 inches and then go over and collect the corresponding weight, that's our standard weight at 35 inches. I can look at this across jurisdictions because we have good biological collections coming from creel surveys and from our Fish and Wildlife Service partners mass marking program, where they have their biotechs out collecting heads from stocked fish and other information from wild fish. So we have information around the lake, much like the weir information. We see really similar patterns across jurisdictions. And so just looking at this as a whole, we see similar things. Here's those really rapid fluctuations I was talking about corresponding to alewife year classes. But in recent years, we've generally seen sort of a downward trajectory, similar to what we saw at the weirs, although maybe not quite as pronounced when you're looking at this standard weight as opposed to the weighted age 3 for females. Notably here, there's these bigger fluctuations in recent years, this bumping up and down. There was a good year class of alewives in 21. We see the fish responding to that. Another good year class of alewives in 23 that the fish responded to in 24. So we're starting to see these annual fluctuations corresponding to year classes of alewives that are present. Our second indicator is the catch rate of Chinook salmon from charter boats. So the reporting that all you charter boat anglers are doing, we're taking a look at those catch rates and examining that over time. So we have our harvest patterns across the different jurisdictions. So each of these lines represents the states. We have our effort patterns through time, and we have our catch rates. In general, I'm showing these jurisdictions simply to just show that most of the harvest in Lake Michigan is driven by Michigan and Wisconsin. I think largely because we have the most water, so there's the most effort that's happening here, and so we have higher catch rates across Michigan and Wisconsin. Effort in general has been relatively stable compared to the harvest patterns. So harvest has in some cases tripled in the last 5 years, whereas effort has not changed that much, and so that's resulted in a catch rate. So the number of fish caught, this is per angler hour, has really gone up in recent years. And so taking all those jurisdictions collectively, like I said, before we were below 50,000 fish harvested, in 2020 when sizes were much larger, to approaching almost 125,000 fish in 2025. So a substantial increase in harvest lake wide. Whereas effort has been, sort of bouncing around between 600,000 and 700,000 angler hours. I pointed out in other talks, and I think this is just sort of an interesting side note here, that the patterns in effort, I think, reflect economic, drivers much more than patterns in the fishery. I think in general, charter boat anglers, they have to go out and try to fish, right? And so there's a relatively steady amount of effort, and that these patterns correspond to things like a housing market crash in 2008 or COVID, in 2020, and then similar increases that I'm guessing are related to things like federal stimulus packages that sort of created this influx of money back into the economy. I'm not an economist. I'm sort of guessing at that, but there's sort of interesting patterns that show up there. All that aside, as an interesting sort of sidebar, effort has been relatively constant compared to harvest, and so we've seen this this pretty substantial increase in catch rates, and actually a tripling of catch rates. All right, so those are our first two indicators. The third indicator is the percent composition of angler harvested weight by species. And so now we're going to take a look at the salmon and trout community in Lake Michigan as a whole. And so, 5 major salmonids in Lake Michigan, starting with brown trout. Again, the lines corresponding to each of the different jurisdictions. Brown trout harvest in Lake Michigan is not surprisingly driven by what's happening in Wisconsin. That's where the vast majority of brown trout harvest happens. But it's been on a pretty steep downward trajectory, basically since we've been tracking it. Maybe in recent years, there's been a bit of an uptick. Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, all of us, not a ton of harvest happening with respect to brown trout. Chinook salmon, this is similar to what we just looked at with the charter catch rates, has been increasing for the last 5 or 6 years. Again, driven largely by what's happening in Michigan and Wisconsin. Coho salmon are a little more interesting. We see these bigger fluctuations from year to year. Much like the size of Chinook salmon, these catch rates are corresponding to when we're seeing year classes of alewives. So, again, 2010 was a good year class of alewives. In 2011, we see this response where there's many more coho salmon that are being caught. I think that likely is a result of higher survival. So as those coho salmon are coming out, they're matched up nicely with the cohort of alewives that also just recruited. And so they have this perfect synchrony where a small coho salmon has these tiny alewives and they get to grow up with that year class of alewives and just survive better. 2010 year class of alewives right there. 2012 year class of alewives shows up right there. 15 and 16 were better year classes of alewives. It shows up as a peak here. And then again in 21 and 23, we saw year classes of alewives, and the coho salmon fishery responds almost immediately to those. With this 23 year class of alewives, we really saw a boom in coho salmon fishing in 24. In 25, it was good, but not as good as that 24 year class. Lake trout is similarly interesting. I think this is really showing the reciprocal pattern in a fishery here, where when fishing is really good for silverfish, people aren't targeting lake trout. And so when Chinook salmon fishing is good, say look at like this 2005 kind of time frame, nobody's fishing for lake trout, and so catch rates go way down. Now, correspondingly, when Chinook salmon fishing is tough, like we saw, around 2020, we saw much higher catch rates of lake trout, particularly in Michigan waters. Now, more recently, we've seen catch rates, especially in Michigan, but across jurisdictions declining, probably because Chinook salmon fishing has gotten better, and also because of reductions, possibly also because of reductions in lake trout stocking, particularly in the southern waters of Lake Michigan. Steelhead have been, they bounce around a lot, but they've been relatively more stable. There's no real strong trajectories there. Noting here that there is with major ecosystem changes around 2004 or 2005, that we see in a lot of our other sort of time series, especially in lower food web things like, zooplankton community composition, water clarity, all sorts of things. We also saw this change where steelhead was sort of at an average level that was much higher. And then after that period, we see it's sort of lower, which I think is just corresponding to lower survival. So we can take all these things together. Same overall story. Brown trout has been declining. Chinook salmon has been increasing. Coho salmon have these annual fluctuations corresponding to prey fish. Lake trout have this reciprocal pattern with lake trout, and steelhead has been sort of bouncing along, maybe at a lower average than what it was back in the 90s. We can stack all these on top of one another to see sort of how these compare, on an overall, what's being harvested out there, what proportion is Chinook salmon, coho, lake trout, et cetera. In 2025, it was about 80% or 85% Chinook and coho salmon. And so we can look at it, making this on a scale that's 0 to 100%. We really see that harvest was dominated by this, Chinook and coho salmon in 2025, with lake trout and steelhead making up relatively small proportions and brown trout being pretty negligible. So those are the indicators that we have updated at this point. One thing that we can do because these are good indicators of predator-prey balance, I can actually relate these indicators to the predator-prey ratio. And so just for instance here, this is the standard weight of a 35-inch Chinook salmon. And so as the size of a salmon, as the standard weight of a 35-inch salmon increases, we see that predator-prey ratio is decreasing. So we have smaller predator-prey ratios, which makes a lot of sense, right? So what I said is that a lower predator-prey ratio, there's more prey relative to the number of predators. So with more prey being available, you have a larger standard weight at 35 inches. Same thing for the weight of an age 3 female that's returning to weirs. The size goes up as there's more prey, that's available. Now the catch rate is the exact opposite, where you have higher catch rates. That probably means there's more salmon in the lake, which means that there's probably fewer prey relative to the number of predators that are out there. So I can take each of these relationships, which are pretty good for biological data, and actually in sort of another interesting sort of sidebar. If I were to take these and smooth them over a few years, so I were to say, okay, I'm going to look at the standard weight of a 35-inch Chinook salmon or the average over the last 3 years, that's going to correspond really nicely to the predator-prey ratio over that same time period, because these salmon, their size at 35 inches isn't necessarily related to what happened just last year. It's related to what happened over their lifetime in the lake, right? So if you do this like 3-year averaging, like smoothing, you get a really nice relationship that increases the sort of like the fit of these points to that line. But because in this exercise, I'm trying to use the most recent year to predict out, I didn't do that. So here I'm taking each one of these, these indicators, so like standard weight at 35 inches, and I'm using that relationship to try to predict what the predator-prey ratio is going to be. And so if I did that for the time series, the model value for the predator-prey ratio is this black line. The predicted value from that standard weight would be the red line. I do the same thing for the weight of an H3 or using charter catch rates, and I get a pattern for each of these lines that pretty closely reflects what we're seeing with our model data. Maybe it misses some of the peaks around 2010. Maybe it doesn't get quite as low as where we got in 2020, but in general, it shows a pretty strong fit to what's actually going on. And across the board, all of these indicators are suggesting that we're going to see an increase in the predator-prey ratio in 2025, which means, as I've sort of belabored here, that means there's going to be fewer prey relative to the number of predators. All right. So the last 3 indicators I want to talk about here are all sort of related to one another, and they all are coming from our prey model. This is what we're using to get our alewife biomass, so that the denominator of that predator-prey ratio. The first indicator is the biomass of alewives. The second indicator is predation mortality rate on alewives. And the last one is the age structure of the alewife population. And to me, these are all really closely related to one another. And I'll get into this here a little bit. But basically, as you have more predation mortality, so that predators are consuming more of these alewives, you're going to pull biomass down, right? That makes sense. The other thing that it's going to do is it's going to prevent your alewives from reaching older ages. And so you're going to see that the age structure of that population, the number of ages that are represented, start to be skewed toward younger fish because they just can't make it out to those older ages, right? So these things are all sort of linked to one another, and I'll provide an example of this here. So this top panel is alewife biomass through time. So going back to 1985, or sorry, 1975, all the way through 2025. This is what alewife biomass has been doing in the lake. And this is the corresponding estimates of mortality rates by the number of predators that were out there. So we know how many predators, we have some estimate of how many predators were out there. We know how fast they were growing. And we know how much alewives they had to eat in order to grow at that rate. And so we can estimate what consumption is and get at mortality. There's 2 periods in time where we saw consistent multi-year increases in alewife biomass. In the entire time series, there's 2 periods where this happened. That was in the 1990s. And then more recently in this early 2020s kind of time period, or rate, leading up to 2020. So back in the 90s, there's a bacterial kidney disease outbreak that resulted in extremely poor survival of Chinook salmon. And so there weren't very many of them out there. The ones we were putting out there just weren't surviving. And so that allowed the alewife, that resulted in very low predation mortality rates. We see predation mortality rates that were less than 0.3. So at those very low predation mortality rates, we see this accumulation of alewife biomass. The other thing that we saw was an expansion of their age composition. So now instead of just having, age 0, 1, 2, 3, we were seeing alewives all the way out to age 7 or older. So very large alewives. Now, that pattern started to be replicated here again in the early 2020s, where we saw predation mortality rates very low, corresponding to reduced stocking levels, and poor wild production. I think in that case, maybe there were some poor river conditions to produce fish. It could also be that these wild fish responded to the same thing that managers did. There were poor prey conditions that were out there, and so the fish just didn't survive well coming out of the rivers. And that allowed the alewife biomass to recover. Now compare that to this period during the early 2000s leading up to about 2015, where we saw a very consistent decline in alewife biomass, a prolonged consistent decline. That corresponded to predation mortality rates that were greater than 0.5. So at these higher mortality rates, alewife biomass was being driven down. At those lower alewife biomasses, it allowed alewife biomass to recover. And so, very, very simply, if the goal is to increase alewife biomass, you want to keep those predation mortality rates low based on this sort of retrospective analysis of what's happened. If you want to decrease alewife biomass, having these predation mortality rates in excess of 0.5 is likely to do that. And so if we were to take all that together, this is that predator-prey ratio figure. So we know Chinook salmon biomass has been increasing. It's reflected in your catch rates. It's reflected in the size of the salmon. Alewife biomass has been declining correspondingly. The predator-prey ratio has been increasing. And we now see that predation mortality rate has sort of crept up above that 0.5 mark. So that's all I have. I know I throw a lot of, I'm sort of a numbers person. I get excited about these graphs and figures. And so I throw a lot at you, but I did put a picture on that first slide. But that's what I've got. So if you have any, I don't know if I have time for questions or.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ben.